Welcome to this episode. The Viking Age is often portrayed as a time of exploration, conquest, and expansion by Scandinavian warriors. However, one of the lesser known but critical aspects of Viking society was their involvement in the global economy, including the human slave trade. While Viking raids and pillaging are frequently highlighted, their role as traders, particularly in the buying and selling of human beings, remains a vital part of their history. In this global network, the Moors, who were predominantly black Africans ruling vast territories in the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa, played an essential role. The Moors bought European slaves from the Vikings, underscoring the reality that slavery is not a phenomenon unique to any single race or culture. Rather, it was a transcontinental system involving various peoples, including Africans who bought and sold slaves of different ethnic backgrounds, including white Europeans. The Vikings were more than just marauding warriors. They were also traders, deeply embedded in the economic systems of the time. Slavery was an integral part of their society, as it was for most civilizations, and Viking raids often resulted in the capture of slaves, known in Old Norse as thralls. These captives were either used for labour within Viking households and farms, or traded for goods with other societies, including the black African Moors. The primary source of slaves for the Vikings was the various peoples they encountered during their raids across Europe. They targeted the British Isles, the Slavic territories in Eastern Europe, and parts of modern-day France. Vikings would descend upon villages, monasteries, and towns, capturing people to be sold as slaves. These captives were diverse in origin, including Anglo-Saxons, Celts, and Slavs, hence the linguistic origin of the word slave from the Slavic people. The enslaved captives were taken back to Scandinavian markets or transported along Viking trade routes. From there, they were sold in major trading hubs or exchanged with other civilizations, including the Moors in Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. The Viking slave trade was not merely a European affair. It was a transcontinental system involving African buyers, underscoring the shared global participation in slavery. Slavery was a fundamental part of Viking society. Thralls worked as labourers on farms, artisans, and domestic servants, fulfilling essential economic roles. However, Vikings were not content to keep all of their captives for themselves. The trade of human beings became an integral part of their economy, enriching the Norse elite and facilitating further exploration and expansion. The Vikings' vast network of trade routes stretched from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean and the Middle East, providing them with access to a wide range of markets where they could exchange white slaves for goods such as silver, gold, textiles, spices, and even weaponry. The exchange of slaves for wealth further empowered the Vikings, making their long voyages possible and their dominance over certain regions of Europe more secure. During the Viking Age, much of the Iberian Peninsula was under the control of the Moors, who were rulers of African origin, predominantly black Africans from West Africa and North Africa. These rulers, who established the Umayyad Caliphate of al-Andalus, were known for their advanced civilization, which was marked by significant achievements in science, mathematics, philosophy, and architecture. The Black Moors created a cosmopolitan society in Iberia that became one of the intellectual and cultural centres of the medieval world. Slavery, while often seen through the lens of European involvement, was a widespread institution across the African and Islamic worlds long before and during the Viking Age. African and Arab traders had been capturing and selling slaves for centuries, with slaves coming from various ethnic backgrounds, including both Africans and Europeans. In Moorish society, slaves were acquired through warfare or trade and played a variety of roles, from domestic workers and artisans to soldiers and labourers. The black African Moors were part of a global network of trade that connected Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. They were eager buyers of European slaves who were valued not only for their labour, but also for their exoticism. This challenges the conventional narrative that slavery was a one-directional system where only Africans were enslaved. In reality, black African Moors, like other civilizations, bought and sold slaves of different races, including white Europeans. This participation underscores the global nature of slavery and dispels the myth that it was a racialized institution from its inception. One striking example comes from the Spanish historian Father Mariana, who noted, regarding the invasion of Europe by African Moors, that the reins of their horses were as fire, their faces black as pitch. The very look of them was so terrifying that the people fled from them as from a devouring pestilence. Oh, luckless Spain! This vivid description emphasizes the striking contrast between the dark-skinned Moors and the local populations of Spain, reinforcing the large presence of black Africans among the Moorish rulers. The connection between the Vikings and the black African Moors in the slave trade was one of economic pragmatism. The Vikings supplied slaves from Europe to the Moors in exchange for goods, making both parties beneficiaries of this human trafficking system. The Moors, with their expansive trade networks in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and beyond, represented a lucrative market for the Vikings. The Viking raids on the Iberian Peninsula brought them directly into contact with the Black Moors. In 844 AD, Viking ships sailed up the Guadalquivir River and attacked the city of Seville, then under Moorish control. Although initially successful, the Viking forces were eventually repelled by the Moors. Despite this defeat, the Vikings continued to raid the coasts of Iberia and France, capturing white slaves, whom they sold to the Moors and other civilizations. The raids opened up channels for both conflict and trade between the Vikings and the Moors. Over time, rather than engaging solely in warfare, the Vikings and Moors developed more cooperative relations. The Vikings provided a steady supply of white European slaves, while the Moors offered valuable goods, including silver, gold, textiles, and spices. This trade relationship highlights the pragmatism of both civilizations, where economic benefit often outweighed ideological or religious differences. The Viking slaves sold to the Moors found themselves in bustling slave markets in cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Valencia, major centers of commerce in Al-Andalus. These European slaves were in high demand among the black African Moors, partly because of their rarity and distinct physical characteristics. Female slaves, in particular, were often used in domestic service or within harems, while male slaves were employed as soldiers, bodyguards, or labourers. The Viking slave trade, therefore, became an essential part of a broader Mediterranean and North African system of exchange, where slaves of different races were traded across continents. The Moors' participation in this trade, alongside other African societies, challenges modern assumptions that the African continent was only ever a victim of slavery. Black African Moors were active agents in the global trade of human beings, buying and selling white European slaves, among others. The Viking Moorish slave trade had profound implications for both civilizations. For the Vikings, the economic benefits were immense. The wealth acquired through the sale of slaves allowed them to finance their long voyages and further exploration. It also helped sustain their dominance over certain parts of Europe, as the influx of foreign goods and wealth strengthened their economies. For the black African Moors, European slaves provided labour and military power. These slaves played critical roles in the economy of Al-Andalus contributing to agriculture, construction, and domestic service. Some even found themselves in positions of influence within the military or households, indicating the complex nature of slavery in medieval Moorish society. The exchange of slaves between Vikings and Moors also facilitated a broader cultural interaction between Northern Europe and the Islamic and African worlds. Captured slaves brought with them their languages, beliefs, and customs, and while their primary role was as labourers, they also contributed to a subtle blending of cultures. In cities like Cordoba, which was a major intellectual centre, the presence of European slaves likely influenced the exchange of ideas and knowledge between different cultures. This cultural exchange was not limited to European slaves assimilating into Moorish society. It also worked in the opposite direction. Vikings, exposed to the sophisticated civilization of the black African Moors, would have carried new ideas, technologies, and knowledge back to Scandinavia, contributing to the intellectual and cultural development of the Norse world. By the end of the 11th century, the Viking slave trade began to decline, partly due to the Christianization of Scandinavia. As Viking rulers and their people converted to Christianity, the enslavement of fellow Christians became increasingly unacceptable. This moral and ideological shift, combined with the growing political power of European kingdoms, reduced the Vikings' ability to capture and sell slaves. Additionally, the political and military might of Viking territories weakened over time, causing a gradual end to their dominance in Europe. Without the ability to maintain their slave trade routes and acquire new captives, the transcontinental exchange between the Vikings and black African Moors slowly diminished. In conclusion, the history of the Viking slave trade and the involvement of the black African Moors highlight the complexities of human trafficking in the medieval world. Slavery was not merely a one-dimensional institution, but rather a dynamic and multifaceted system involving various peoples across continents. The Vikings' role in capturing and selling slaves to the Moors illustrates the interconnectedness of societies and the shared nature of human suffering. As we examine the past, it is essential to recognize the agency of those involved in the slave trade, both victims and perpetrators. The narrative surrounding slavery must acknowledge the participation of various groups, including the Moors, who were active in the trade of human beings. The interplay between Vikings and Moors serves as a reminder that slavery is not a singular historical experience, but a shared legacy that transcends racial and cultural boundaries. And yet, in modern discussions about reparations and justice, it's clear that the history of slavery is far more intricate than the simplified narratives we often hear. After all, turns out the reparations paperwork might be a bit more complicated than we earlier thought. But this complexity doesn't diminish the importance of addressing historical wrongs. It highlights the need for a deeper understanding of the interwoven experiences of oppression and agency across history. Thanks for watching this episode. Do remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share, and look out for the next one on Africa's great civilizations.